Hello all, welcome again. We're going to continue in Hilchos Tefillah Uberchas Kohanim, Hilchos the laws of davening, laws of prayer. With the Rambam, again, I'm Eli Backman over at College Park, where we just celebrated a wonderful Rosh Hashanah, all things considered. And we're continuing. I hope everybody's been able to keep up over Rosh Hashanah, but we're going to continue on where today's quota, today's chapter is, which is Perek Yud Bet, the 12th chapter. It's not a hard chapter in contents, but it's a little bit long, and it goes through a lot of laws which you may be familiar with in some ways from davening and services in shul that you attend. Perek Shnei Masar. And again, questions that are part of the conversation are always welcome. Questions that are longer will hold till the end. Aleph, the very first chapter here, very first line. Halacha, as we call it. Moshe Rabbeinu tikkun lehem liYisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu instituted for Bnei Yisrael, for the Jewish community, sheyukarin b'Torah, that they should read from the Torah barabim in public, b'Shabbat, on Shabbat, b'Sheni v'Chamishi, on Monday and on Thursday, b'Shacharit, in the morning. So you should not have a duration of 3 days without hearing Torah. The Gemara learns the passage that says, they went 3 days and they did not find water, and they started complaining to desert and all that took place after that. So we learn from there, you shouldn't go 3 days without mayim. Mayim al Torah, mayim means Torah, so therefore you should not go 3 days. So we read on Shabbat, we read on Monday, we read on Thursday, so we never have a 3-day duration. The Ezra Tikkun, when Bnei Yisrael returned from the first Galut, they came back to Israel, was Ezra Hanaga. So Ezra Tikkun, Ezra instituted Sheyukarin came by Mincha b'chol Shabbat, that it should also read on Mincha of all Shabbat, meaning Yoshvei Karanot, because of those who sit in the marketplace, and they were not always able to attend on Monday and Thursday, but they were in shul for Shabbat. So he's figured, let's give them another opportunity at least to hear some Torah reading. Don't forget, in those days, not everyone had books. It was much harder to learn. So this opportunity afforded them another chance to learn something from the Torah and to start preparing, as we know, we read for the coming week. But Gam Hu Tikkun and Ezra also set up that on Monday and Thursday we should read three. We should have,
I did.
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and then
three people called up to the Torah.
Low temperature.
I just turned it up.
And we should not read less than 3 psukim. In other words, less than 10, me'asar psukim, less than 10 psukim. In other words, we always need to have 10 psukim and 3 people. The second halacha, these are the day shekarim that we read Torah in public in shul. What are they? B'Shabbatot and Shabbos, b'Moadim and Yom Tov, Chagim, b'Rosh Chadashim and Rosh Chodesh, u'v'Tainis, and on a fast day, public fast days like today's from Gedalim, u'v'Chanukah and on Chanukah, v'Purim and on Purim, u'v'Sheni v'Chamishi sheb'chol Shavua v'Shavua on Monday and Thursday of each week. V'im aftir b'Neviim Ella b'Shabbasos v'Yomim Tovim, and we do not do a haftarah except on Shabbos and Yom Tov v'Tisha B'av Bilvad. And Tisha B'av. Now, if you go to shul, you'll notice today by Mincha that we do after the Ramah, the Ashkenazi custom, which has become the common custom for many of us, do read after the fast day at Mincha. But other than Rambam says only in Shabbos, Yom Tov, and Tisha B'av do you have haftarah. Gimel went the third halach in the third paragraph. You cannot take out the Torah and read publicly with less than 10 grown men, which is what we call a minyan. You need to have a minyan. Then current pachas may start psukim, and you're not allowed to read less than 10 psukim. Vayidaber oila mina minyan. Many of you are familiar that the first pasuk of many of the parshiot is Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe. So the Rambam says that is counted as one of the 10 psukim. V'lo yiu our current pachas b'shleish anashim, and we should never call up to the Torah less than 3 people. And when you begin to read a parsha, now the parsha here doesn't necessarily mean the parsha that we divided it weekly, but we divided it as there are various things which we call stumos and psuchos, and we get to Hilchos Sefer Torah, we'll learn more details. There's something like 669 of these parshiyot. So Rambam says when you begin one, you shouldn't read less than 3 psukim of it. And if you want to end your aliyah, the reading, with 2 psukim to the end, don't do that. Finish it up. We should never call a person to read for less than 3 psukim. Now, just as a footnote, and you'll see how this kind of comes out in various halachot as we go through here, the halachos here, is that the Rambam is talking about the way they used to read the Torah, where the person who was called up actually read the Torah. Today we don't do that. Today we have a Balkara who reads, and people get called up for an aliyah and stand next to the Balkara. In those days, you got called up, and you did your own reading. So you should not read less than 3 psukim when you go up. Shlosha shekinah dalad, we're in halacha 4. Shlosha shekaru asar psukim. When you have 3 people and we're reading 10 psukim. Shnayim karin shloisha shloisha. 2 of them are going to read 3, so 3 plus 3 is 6. Ve'echad arba, the third one will read 4 equals 10. Uvein shahaya akar abar rishon oy achron oy emsai harei the mishubach. And whether the 4 is the first, the second, or the third doesn't matter. It's all fine. Halacha hey. Kol echad ve'echad min akarin. Anyone who's opens unrolls the Torah and looks down and finds the place he's about to read. By the way, there's a lot of halachas if you make a mistake. If the person reading shows you the wrong parsha and you make a bracha, there are times you actually need to make another bracha. There are times you don't need to. It depends. It's a little complicated, so hopefully it doesn't happen. And if it does, hopefully the rabbi is standing right there to help make the decision. But the generic idea is if open in front of you is what you're going to read included in what he shows you, then you don't necessarily have to. If it's completely different, then you probably would have to. But again, that's a generic statement. But the Rambam says, look where you're going to read first. And then you say, Baruch Hashem Mavarach. You'll recognize this from Shul, you say, Baruch Hu. And everybody in the community answered, Baruch Hashem Mavarach L'olam Va'ed. Everybody answered Baruch Hashem Mavarach. And then the reader continues and makes the bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher b'chabanu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu es Torah so. Baruch atah Hashem nosein Torah. And then he continues and makes the first bracha on the Aliyah, which we're used to hearing, that Hashem has given us the Torah. And if you notice, it's in the present, not in the past, because the giving of the Torah is a constant. And before we start to read from the Torah, we want to make sure we acknowledge the giver in the present of the Torah. So therefore the Torah is a revered, sacred idea, not just another textbook, if you wish, that we're reading. Everybody answers Amen. And then he continues to read until he finishes his part, his 3 psukim, 4 psukim, whatever his part is. And then he rolls close the Sefer Torah. And then he says the second bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher nasan lanu Torah so Torah emes v'chaya olam nata b'sochenu. Baruch atah Hashem nosen Torah, who has given us his Torah and he's implanted within us chaya olam, eternal life. B'asadar you, who gives us the Torah. First bracha was more asher b'char banu, has chosen us the people and given us the Torah. The second one is focused more on giving of the Torah. And that's what you do. So it's the same thing in Shul today. You get called up for an aliyah, you look at where it is, you roll it closed, point to money. Some still leave it open and shut their eyes. But then you say your baruch Hu, everyone answers, you say the bracha, you read, after you finish reading, you close it, and you say the second bracha. Many have a custom of touching the spot before and after and kissing with their talit, or with the piece of that ties around the Torah. But that the Rambam doesn't mention, but that's a custom by many. Vav. The Balkara, the one reading, is not allowed to start reading his part until everybody finished saying Amen. So remember, he's saying a bracha, Baruch atah Hashem, no saying Torah. He has to wait for the community to say Amen, and then he can begin. The Rambam says if he's reading and makes a mistake, even in one letter, you make him start over and go back. until he reads it perfectly well. Now, again, a lot of complicated halachas like this, you may hear in shul that sometimes you go back, sometimes you don't go back. The general idea, again, the general is too long and complicated to get the details down, but the general idea is if the word will be changed to the extent that it changes the meaning, in Hebrew, a different letter pronunciation could change the word to a whole new meaning. It could change the tense of the word, past, present, future, or it could change actually the word to mean another word. If that's the case, you for sure must fix it and read it over. If it doesn't change a meaning, according to many, then you don't have to necessarily read it again. The Rambam doesn't make those differentiations. He just says clearly, you make a mistake in even one letter, you have to go back. Now the Rambam continues and says, but two people should not read at the same time because you can't hear two voices. But one alone, which is why today when we're not reading it, we get called up, we say a bracha, we're supposed to read it quietly to ourselves together with the Bakara. Because we made the bracha, it's our aliyah, we're supposed to read it. But we can't read it too loud because if we read it too loud, the community will hear two voices. That will be a problem. So we read it quietly to ourselves. And since we're not sure that everybody being called up these days knows the proper pronunciation, the proper vowels, etc., therefore the community custom has become to have one person read it and you can read along listening to them, following it along and reading at the same time. Karav and Ishtaktek. You started the Balkara, the person reading gets up to reading slowly, he can't read anymore. He loses his voice. Something happens to him. Another person can get up right away and continue. And it begins from the place where the person who lost his voice began, and then he makes a bracha at the end. So the first bracha, he counts from the first person. He reads over the parts, the 3 psukim, etc., that he has to read, and then he makes the bracha at the end. 7. Halacha Zayin. The person beginning to read the Torah cannot read until the Gadol Shebetzibur, the rabbi, the great leader of the community, of that community, tells him to begin. And even if he's the general chazan of the Knesset, he's the regular person who leads everyone. Or Rosh Knesset, he's the president of, however you want to define, the head of the community here. He cannot just say, I have the authority to begin reading whenever I want. He has to wait until the community tells him, or the rabbi, the greatest one amongst the community, tells him. In other words, you can't take this upon yourself. It's a communal reading. You need to wait till the community gives you the permission to do so. And another person stands next to him during Kriya, like the chazan who stands next to the readers. Now again, this was in those days. I got called up for my aliyah, I would walk up individually and I'd stand there and I would read. So the Rambam's saying that's not good. Put another person to stand up there next to you, even though he's not reading. Why? And then the Gemara in Yishalmi, the Talmud Yishalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, I believe it is, makes a quote that we want to compare to Har Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, Moshe took the luchot from Hashem and gave them to us. So there's sort of a middle person who helped make the transition. So therefore, we have another person from the reader, so to say, to the community. So we're reenacting Har Sinai as best we can. But in any event, the Rambam doesn't say why, it just says have another person. Today, that happens all the time. Because another person gets called up, so you have the reader and the person who's called up automatically there. There are some shows that in particular have someone else stand on each side of the bima, and that's a community custom. But the Rambam's talking about at least one other person next to the reader. Halacha Ches. The person who's reading can skip parts around as long as it's still one theme. Kigon, for example, Achre Mos, Va'ach Be'esar, Sheba Pashas Emor Elakonim. Achre Mos Kedoshim Emor. There's 3 parshas in a row in Sefer Vayikra, in the third part of Chumash, and the first and the last, Achre Mos and Emor, both speak about Yom Kippur. So you could, the Rambam says, start reading the first one, which talks about one part of Yom Kippur, and then skip to the third one and continue reading about Yom Kippur. It kind of combines the theme of Yom Kippur. But he's not allowed to read it by heart, which means he has to be able to roll the Torah to the right place and continue reading inside. Because it's forbidden to read by heart, verbally, without reading inside even one word, the Rambam says, which is an important thing to remember. When you are reading from the Torah, take a bar mitzvah boy. He's been practicing for 12 months his parsha. He knows it by heart practically. He gets up there and he says, "Vayomer Hashem el Moshe levar." That's not good. You have to teach him that even though you know this by heart, you need to look inside to be able to follow along and read it word for word from the inside. We're going to start learning soon more halachot about something called a meturgaman. A meturgaman was an interpreter, a translator. In those days, there would stand a fellow next to the Balkara who would translate what he was reading so people would understand. Again, they didn't have books on their laps. They didn't have Chumash with English or whatever translation, for sure not. So this way, in order for them to be involved and engaged and learning at the same time, which is the ultimate goal of Torah reading, he would read a pasuk, whoever is reading, and the translator would translate it. So the Rambam says, we can't schlep the community along. So in other words, you get up and you read a pasuk in the Parsha Achrei Mos, for example, and the translator is translating this pasuk. During that minute and a half of his translation, you quickly roll to Parshas Emor and continue reading, that's fine. But if it takes him a minute to translate and it takes you 10 minutes to find the next place, that's not allowed. You can do it as long as it takes the translator, so we're not schlepping the community longer. There's an aspect which we're going to see also in these halachos, that the tzibur, the community, has a certain respect that we offer it. It creates an element that demands a respect. So we don't schlep it out. We treat it a certain way, who we call up to read for it, etc. And this is one of those. We're not going to say, well, give me a minute while I start looking for where I want to go. No. While he's translating, he's already doing something for the community. That's fine. Take that time. But don't go longer. Test, the ninth halacha. Once the reader begins to read in the Torah, also everyone in the community must be quiet and cannot speak, even halacha. You can't teach someone something. But everybody must listen and attentively listen. Place their heart, the Rambam says. In other words, really pay attention to what is being read. The prophet Nehemiah makes a quote that the ears of the people were towards the Torah, which means that's all they were doing is paying attention. So it's not right during Torah reading to go ahead and start reading another book and start even learning during that time. The Rambam continues, we're not allowed to leave the shul during the time of Kriyas HaTorah. But some say, but the Rambam says you are allowed to go during the time when someone else is called up. So let's say you need to leave the room. Whatever, something happens, you need to leave. Wait until the reader finishes reading that part. And while they're calling up the next person, walk out the door. But once the reader begins reading, don't leave. It's disrespectful until the reader finishes reading. We once had this conversation. We visited an individual who was Torah Nasta, that his entire vocation was Torah. That's all he did. And we spoke about it then by Berachas Krishma, how much Krishma he has to say, etc. This person, he's allowed to continue learning during the time that the Torah is being read. Anybody looking at him wouldn't say it's disrespectful because they know his life is entirely Torah. And he's continuing to learn and gain from the Torah at the same time. I don't feel, by the way the Rambam described it back then, there's really such a person. That was Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, greatest of the great Tanoim, authors of the Mishnah and the Talmud. Such an individual was called Torah Nasa, but not people who sit and learn today per se. So today we should stop and listen to the Kriyas HaTorah. 10. Well, halacha 10. Mimos Ezra, from the time of Ezra. Nagu sheyesham turgum mitargum la'am mashar korah Torah. This idea of this translator I was mentioning a moment before begins by Ezra. Ezra set it up that there will be someone to translate what is being read to the people listening. So they should understand what is happening. And the reader reads one verse, he's quiet, until the translator translates that pasuk. And then he continues and reads the next pasuk. He can never read more than one pasuk at a time. We don't want to confuse him, and this fellow is also doing it by heart, the translator, and he might get lost. So we say to the reader, one pasuk at a time only. Yud Aleph 11, and neither the reader nor the translator should raise their voices to a higher level, to a higher octave, to sound louder than each other. They have to be at the same level. And the translator cannot begin translating until the reader finishes the pasuk. So the translator knows what's going on. So he's anxious to get it out there. He starts right away, and he doesn't realize that the community hasn't heard the complete reading of the pasuk. That's not good. You must wait until he finishes. The same thing in the reverse. And the reader cannot continue to do the next verse until the translator completely finishes his translation. The translator is not allowed to lead, not on a beam and not on a pillar, but he should stand with awe and with reverence. He should not read the Targum from a book. He shouldn't stand in front of himself as a book of the translation. He has to do it by heart. Why? One of the things is because we don't want people to think that the translation is written in the Torah as well. We're very particular to make sure that the Torah remains as is. Torah Shebechsav, with its fine lettering and wording, etc. from Moshe. So therefore, we don't have a reading. That's the reason, by the way, that many people will shut the Torah before they say the bracha, and those who don't roll it close will turn their head away and shut their eyes to show everyone that the bracha is not in the Torah, but clearly the words of the Torah are in the Torah. So therefore, this translator has to do it by heart and should not have a book. And for the same reason, and the Rambam is going to spell it out right here, the reader is not allowed to help. So let's say the reader is listening to the translator, and the translator misses the point. He says, oh, by the way, you're not allowed to do that. Why? Because people will think that the reader is reading the translation from the Torah. A katan, a person, a younger person, or a smaller person in stature, okay, can be a translator for a greater person, but not a reverse, because it's not respectful. That a greater person, so it needs this younger child to get up and translate for him. So he said that was a disrespectful for the community, for the person. So a lesser stature, a smaller, younger person could do it for a big, greater, older person, but not in reverse. You can't have two translators, rather one translator and one reader. Your base. Going at a little bit of a faster pace because we have still quite a bit to go in this parak, and it's a long parak, but hopefully you're all picking up the ideas as they're not too complicated, and many you're familiar with. 12. Like Christ in the Rambam starts quoting the Gemara, then not all verses of Torah are translated. Maisa Ruvain, Birchas Kohanim, Maisa Ha'egel, Min Vayomer Moshe Alar, not Vayar Moshe Azam, Vot Pasik Echad, Vayikav Hashem Asa'am, Kulam Nikram V'Lamitargim. These instances, the story of Ruvain when he switches his father's bed from one tent and from Yaakov from one tent to another. Or the story of or Birchas Kohanim, the priestly blessing, or the story of the eagle, the golden calf, which starts with Yomer Moshe Aaron, and another pasuk Vayikav Hashem Esa'am that God inflicted the people. These are read, but they're not translated. So the story of Ruvain we don't translate because it's disrespectful to Ruvain and to the whole situation. The story of the Egel, according to some, is only one of them, not the second one. The Torah mentions it twice. One time you do translate it, the other time you don't translate it, out of respect for Aaron HaKohen, because Aaron is mentioned, his involvement. We don't want to be disrespectful. And Birchas Kohanim is very interesting. The Gemara says you don't translate Birchas Kohanim. Birchas Kohanim is a priestly blessing, which we all heard, those who were in Shul yesterday and every holiday in Israel every day, where we go under the Talit, we call Birchas Kohanim. Why don't we translate it? The Rashi, quoting in the Gemara, explains, it says Yisa. Yisa Hashem Panav Elecha, that Hashem will turn and incline his face toward you. And there's a pasuk that a judge is not allowed to be master upon him, show inclination towards someone. So because it would look like Hashem is, so to say, breaking the rule and already treating us differently, we don't translate it. Okay, again, there's a lot of other commentary on that, but that's the Rashi's reading into the Gemara. In the Haftarahs, when people were doing the story of Amnon, when Amnon had a illicit relationship with his sister Tamar, it mentions it sort of twice there, and one time it says Amnon ben David. That story we don't read and we don't translate because it's disrespectful to David. It's not one of our Haftarahs today, so seemingly in those days, whoever was reading the Haftarah would pick what they thought connected to the Parsha. Today it's not there. So in any event, we don't read it. Yud Gimel, now we're going to talk about Haftarahs. This was our segue here. Yud Gimel, a mafter ben Navi, if someone is doing the mafter in Navi, in the prophets, he must read in the Torah first to show that the Torah is really what it is, and the Haftarah is secondary. And even if he reads what was read already, that's fine. And that's what we do today. We read 7 aliyot on Shabbat, right? 6 in Yom Kippur, 5 on the holidays. We're going to read that in a minute. And then we say Kaddish, and after Kaddish, the mafter gets called up, and we reread the last few psukim on Shabbos. On a holiday, we read a different one from a second Torah scroll. So it's a little different. But here, we reread the last 3 psukim. You're not allowed to begin the mafter of the Navi until you roll the Sefer Torah. And you're not allowed to do less than 21 psukim. It says, if you finish the entire concept, rather, the storyline that you're studying in Navi, in less than that, you don't have to go further. So if it's a complete story of 19 psukim, you can stop there. Some say, the Rambam says, if you read 10, that's something. The Rambam says that if you read 10 psukim and the translators translate all 10, that's also enough. Even if you don't finish the concept. We're trying to parallel. The Haftarah came along at a time when there's a decree that we cannot read from the Torah publicly. So the rabbis instituted to take a part of the prophets, which would not need to take out the Torah scroll. So we want to have 7 aliyot, and we want to have 3 for each individual. So that's how you get to the 21. So, but the Rambam is saying we don't have to be so strict about it because ultimately we already had the Torah reading. Back in those days, when that was sort of how they broke it up, they may have been a little stricter, but today that's fine to do this. Uven Navi, and now when we're reading these prophets, Echad Kara the Afilu Shnayim Metargim. One person can read and even 2 could translate. We said Torah only 1 here, 2. Umedalik Me'inyin Acher. And you can jump and skip around from one concept to the other. Last time we put restriction here, and there's no restriction. Well, there is a restriction, but not like that one. You can't jump from completely one book to another book. But in the book of Shmuel Aleph, for example, you can jump around as much as you want. But go Shmuel Aleph to Shmuel Bet, or Shmuel Aleph to Mishlei, or whatever else that you can't do. But the Rambam says don't go backwards. Don't go from the end of the book to the beginning. Follow in order. So start at 1, jump to 4, then jump to 8. That's fine. The Rambam does say it's recommended The same thing we said before, that really you should wait, only skip the time and duration it takes the translator to translate. So you don't have to stick exactly to the same theme like we said by Torah, but still try to keep it to that duration so the community is not being schlepped along. Yudalad 14. Akara ben Navi. If we still have a little bit more to go, I know it's 1:30. I hope you guys can hang in longer. I'm going to keep going. And if anyone has to leave, the recording will, God willing, we eventually put up, hopefully today, onto the YouTube channel. But we're going to keep going for those who can stay. Yudalad 14. Hakara ben Navi. We said by Torah that you can only read one pasuk and the translator translates. Here we're saying you can even read three, and the translator will translate all three. But if there are three different sections in the Navi, don't do that. That will be too confusing for you. And then you just do one and one, etc. Hamafter ben Navi 15. Someone who's doing the Mafter ben Navi, Baruch Lefana bracha achas, to make a bracha before. And again, you'll recognize this from Shul. Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, shabacha b'nevim tovim v'chulu. The Rambam doesn't finish no bracha, but that's the bracha that Hashem chose prophets, and therefore we're up to read them. Mavarich la'akrav arba brachas. And afterwards we do four. Again, that's what we do in Shul today. Bracha Rishayna Chosaba Kalaneman B'chol Devara. The first one finishes God who is faithful in all his words. And in other words, the words of a prophet are all faithful, they're all true. Shliach Chosaba Bani Shalayim. The second one is the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Shlishim Chosaba Magen David. The third one we close with the savior, the shield rather of David, the Magen David. We review Chosaba Ini Ketusha Tayom K'meshe Chosaba Tefillah. And the fourth one we connect to that day. And we finish it off like we did in davening, connected to Rosh Chodesh, connected to, we don't do Maftu, connected to Rosh Hashanah, connected to Sukkot, Pesach, etc. Rosh Chodesh lias b'Shabbos. If Rosh Chodesh was on Shabbos, Hamaftu b'Navi Mavski Rosh Chodesh b'Brachos K'meshe Maski b'Tefillah. And we will mention Rosh Chodesh in the difference of opinion about this. Some say you don't because the Maftu doesn't come because of Rosh Chodesh, but the Rambam says you do. Tezayin 16. How many people, we're going back to Torah reading now, how many people get aliyot, how many people get called up to read? B'Shabbos, B'Shachris Ker Shiva. Shabbos is 7. Yom Kippurim Shisha. We're going down in descending order. Yom Kippur is 6. Yom Tov Chamisha. And a Chag on a holiday 5. In Pesach Mehed, Abu Meisif and Alem. You can never go less than 7 on Shabbos, 6 and 5, but Meisif you can go more than them if you need to. Rosh Chodesh and Chol Shemayim Karen Arba. On Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed, which is the next step down, we read 4. Shabbos, Yom Kippur Mincha, V'Sheni V'Chamishi Shakol Shana. And on Shabbos, Yom Kippur Mincha, or Monday and Thursday all year, or Chanukah and Purim Shachris, or B'Mei Ataynis B'Shachris and Mincha, or on a public fast day, Kairin Shleisha, you read 3. In Pesach B'Minyan Zevay, Meisif and Alein, you do not go less, and you do not do more. So in Shabbos, some communities have a custom of adding more minyanim, particularly in Friday communities, but many communities have it. But you can't go less than 7. On the other days that you read 3, you cannot add on that too. Yudayin 17. A lady should not be called up to read because of kavanat tzibur, respect for the community. And again, this is a much longer conversation, but in short, the tzibur has to take on a certain level of its own entity and its own level of respect, as was put into place in those days, instituted that a lady, a child, etc., others, a child, we're going to read about in a minute, wasn't customarily respectful in those days to get up and read. There's also the question of a singing voice, etc. So for those reasons, the lady would not get an aliyah in the community reading. A child who's close to bar mitzvah but knows how to read and knows how to make the bracha could be getting an aliyah. Now, some communities still do this for a child right before bar mitzvah. Most communities today don't do that and do not institute this idea. And the mafter could also count. So the mafter by us doesn't count. We'll see why in the next line. But technically, the 7th person could be the mafter. But if the chazan stopped like we do today, we read 7, then you cover the Torah and you say Kaddish. Bein mashlim, bein amafter, ubein amafter in oilam in a minyan. So then the people who come after that, and the maftir cannot count for the minyan because the Kaddish separates it. So today, the maftir person is not one of the 7, he's an 8th actually after that. But technically speaking, if there's a reason you couldn't do that, okay, nobody else to call up, or the Sefer Torah may have been questionable according to some, and you don't want to read more than you have to read, so then the 7th would go into maftir, but you would not say Kaddish. Sibur, which doesn't practically happen today. Sibur sh'le'hoya b'hem yedei likros elo echad, but the community only has one person who knows how to read. Olav akar of a year, and he goes up, he reads, and he goes down off the bima. V'chodav akar shni or shlishis, and then he gets up and down and up and down. Until he finishes the required amount for that day. So say in Shabbat, he would go up and down 7 times. Clearly, this is talking in those days and not in our days, because in our days the reader is 1, and he stays up there the whole time. And 7 other people come up. But in those days, it was the same person reading, he would have to go up and down to show it's 7 and not just stay up there the whole time. Yud Ches. In every Torah reading that we have, a Kohen reads first, out of respect to the Kohuna, to the priestly, to the Pasuk that we should offer respect to the Kohanim. V'achar of Levi, v'achar of Yisrael, and after him goes a Levi, also out of respect, and then starts the rest of the Yisraels. U'minig bashidu ayom, and the minig is today. That if someone is a Kohen, regardless of how learned and how pious they are, they get number 1 over even the greatest rabbi of the Jewish community who's in that minyan. Whoever is greater in learning than in wisdom than his friend goes first. Which is why many communities, the 3rd Aliyah, which is the first of the Israel, is a very special one. And they reserve that to give that to someone special, because that's the first one who should go first, but the greatest person in the community. They say according to Kabbalah, the 6th one is a special one. But in any event, and the last person who rolls and closes the Sefer Torah sort of receives the reward of them all. And therefore, the last one can even be a great person in the community because he receives the honor of rolling the Torah and receives the reward of everybody, which is just interesting because the way we do Hagbah today, in most shows that you go to, one person lifts and sits down with it open, and then they even offer it to a child sometimes to come and close it, which means that the person who's rolling it could be a child, could be anybody, and he's receiving the greatest reward. Which is why some communities have a custom, such as if you've davened by Chabad, you'll notice the person who lifts it puts it back on the table, and that person rolls it. So that person is doing the lifting, the heavy work, if you wish, literally here, gets the reward of everyone, and then he sits down with it, and the child, or whoever else, comes and just puts on the bendel, the tie, the wrap, etc., the belt, and then the cover. All right. Where are we up to here? 19. Ain't Sham Cohen. What if you have a community that's not Cohen? Happens. You have a minyan without a Cohen. Only Yisrael, then anybody can go up. V'lo yala akrav Levi klal, but a Levi should not go up after Yisrael. So in other words, if you have a Cohen, Levi, Yisrael, that's the order. You have no Cohen, you can start with a Levi if you wish, and then go to Yisrael. Or you can go to Yisrael, the Rambam says. But if you go to Yisrael, the Levi cannot go after the Yisrael. Ain't Sham Levi. What if you have no Levi? You have a Cohen and a Yisrael in the community. Cohen Shikar Rishon Chodev Rekar Hu Atzmei Pam Shniya B'Makom Levi. The Cohen stays and takes the second Aliyah as a Levi. Interestingly, in most communities, the Cohen doesn't step down and come back up, like the Rambam said earlier. The Rambam probably would feel he should, but in any event, that's just a side footnote. I don't know when that custom changed. But why does the Cohen get Levi? Because actually, a Cohen is a Levi. The Kohanim come from Shevet Levi, the children of Levi too.
Rabbi,
Call a second Cohen.
Rabbi, so
Yes.
when you mentioned before, 3 people must do And in the case, it's Cohen can't do twice, so it's only two people.
Correct, but it counts as two aliyot. In other words, it's two breaking up. It's a good question, but my understanding is because you're breaking it up into two aliyot, we count it as two different people with two different brachot. That's why you can make another bracha, even though you just said the first one.
Mm-hmm. And why? We normally only in holidays using a Kohen for blessing and not during the normal days.
You're talking about why is Birchat Kohanim only on the holidays?
Yeah.
So that's a conversation we'll have later when we deal with Birchat Kohanim a little bit more. Israel, some communities do have it every day. In the Beit HaMikdash, where it was instituted originally, they did have it every day. But we feel that the Chabad Siddur, the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe Shneur Zalman, when he put the Siddur together, said, we do it she'oz shuriyim b'simchas Yom Tov, because then you're involved in the happiness of the day, and a Kohen can only give a blessing when he's happy and the community's happy, etc. So those special moments were the times to do it. Not every time, not every Shabbat, etc.
That does it have something to do with somebody told me, because people normally when say it's a Kohen, and some people believe it's a Kohen, but maybe it's not a Kohen. So we try not to go in this direction and to get blessing from somebody who is questionable, and not because it's so we only use holidays for this purpose.
There is some idea, but the truth is, we do believe a Kohen who says he's a Kohen, and it's a long conversation. How do you get into that? Because, for example, a Pidyon Haben is a mitzvah that needs to be a Kohen. If someone says, I'm a Kohen, my father was a Kohen, my grandfather was a Kohen, and we find signs of being a Kohen in their family, for some it's tombstones dating back, for some it's other things, we believe them. So, technically speaking, that logic would say we should never really do it. The Kohen should just leave the shul and never be up there to get called up. But the answer is maybe in some people's mind, but I believe it's more to do that people are rushing too much during the week. There's not the same joy. They don't have the opportunity to appreciate it, because you really need both the Kohen to be in the right mindset of what he's giving a bracha, and the people to be there to receive it as well.
Thank you, Rami.
Okay, you're welcome. But now we're in an interesting question. We're middle of 19. So you had called up a Kohen. What if you have a minyan as two Kohanim and all Yisraelim? So call up one Kohen and then call up the next Kohen. And the answer is no. You cannot call a second Kohen after him. Why? Because remember, it's a great segue to your last question, is that there was a question of who had this ability to be a Kohen, what we call Cheskas Kahuna. In the olden days, when there was Meiser Truma, there was working in a Beis HaMikdash, it was a real serious thing that they kept lineages of families much better than we have today, obviously. So if somebody gets called up as a Kohen, and someone says, oh, can I give him my Truma? Everyone says, oh, he got called up as a Kohen in Shul, he must be a Kohen, and we trust him. But if somebody gets called up as a Kohen, and then a minute later you call up a second Kohen, what are you saying? That the first one wasn't good. So now we're going to disqualify the first Kohen from being a Kohen, and that's not allowed. The only reason that happens because there's no Levi, so for sure it's not right. So therefore, don't call up a second Kohen. Better that the first Kohen should get twice, then another Kohen should be called up. And the same thing, Rambam continues, therefore you can't call one Levi after another Levi. Because maybe you'll say that one of the two is possible, is disqualified. Chaf. What is the order of davening when you have Kriyat HaTorah? We're talking about Kriyat HaTorah, we know when, we know what. When does it fit into davening? So it says, Kol Yom Sheyish Be'Tfilas Musaf. Any day that has Musaf service, which is a Shabbat, a Rosh Chodesh, a holiday, when he finishes Shacharis, we have the repetition. Over Kaddish, Moti Sefer Torah, you take out, you say Kaddish, and you take out the Torah. And you call up the three people from the Torah, etc., and you read the Torah. When you finish, you put the Torah back into its place, the Ark, the Aron HaKodesh. And you say another Kaddish, and you say Musaf. For Yomim sheyesh behem maftir u'musaf, and days when you have maftir and musaf, nogu l'merkadosh kodim sheyala ha-maftir. And the days when you're going to have a haftarah, right? So then you do say a kaddish before the maftir, before the haftarah, like we do in Shabbat and the holidays. And some have the custom to say the kaddish after the maftir. We don't say kaddish after the maftir, but we do say kaddish before musaf later on. So we say the kaddish between the Torah reading and the maftir, which will break up to the second Torah scroll. Interestingly enough, by the way, if you go to today to shul, you'll notice that we do have a haftarah after mincha. The Rambam says we don't do haftarah on a fast that we do. As I said then, the Ashkenazi custom is, but we don't say a kaddish between the haftarah and the Torah reading and the maftir. And the third person is the maftir. It's not a repetition of the last psukim. So the Kohen, the Levi, and then the Yisrael who gets called up will get to do the maftir. In a regular week, when maftir is completely a repetition of the verses after Kaddish, even a Kohen, a Levi could be called up for that aliyah as well. Chaf Aleph, the mincha shel Shabbos v'shel Yom Kippur, the mincha of Shabbos and Yom Kippur, achar shenigmar shleach tzibur tehillah l'David. You first say Ashrei. The Rambam calls it tehillah l'David, which is the name of the Ashrei. The first three psukim were added on to that chapter of Tillim. V'seder hayoyim, and you say the rest of the order of the what is called the days, the order of kedusha, which is like Uval Tzion. And then you say Kaddish. And then you take out a Sefer Torah. And then you read it. So when you don't say Volunteer in the morning by Shachar, like Shabbat and Yom Tov, you say it again by Mincha. Yom Tov, you don't have Torah reading. But on Shabbos, Yom Kippur, when you have Torah reading in the afternoon, you say Ashrei, Volunteer, Kaddish, and then you read the Torah. Umachzira, you put it back. Kaddish was following Mincha, and then you say Kaddish, you daven Mincha. The Chem B'Tainis Kirim Mincha. And also on a fast day like today, you'll read by Mincha. From Kaddish was found Philos Mincha, and then you'll say Kaddish and Mincha. And the Rambam did not seem to have a haftarah on Mincha on a fast day. But Yom Tov because by Mincha, but on Yom Tov the custom was not to read Kriya during Mincha. Chav Beis 12. The Yom She'ei by Musaf, and a day like a Monday and Thursday when we read Torah, but we do not have Musaf. When you finish Shachris, you say Kaddish. And you take out the Sefer Torah and you read in it, and then you put it back. And then you say Kaddish. And only after Kriya will you say the Asher Volatian. Mincha was saying it before because that's the opening of Mincha. Here it's the middle of davening. We're going to say it afterwards. For Kaddish for Cholam Niftar, then you say Kaddish after Volunteer, and technically davening is over. We've some Ashkenazi Nusach says Aleinu right after that, and then Shisha Yom. Others like Nusach Harin Chabad go to Shisha Yom first, and then add a Kalokenu every day. Other Ashkenazim only say it on Shabbos, and then say Aleinu to conclude. But the Rambam said after Valentin they say Kaddish, and then everybody goes on their way. Chav Gimel. You do not read publicly out of a chumash in a shul because of kavod tzibur. Again, the super respect. To get up and read out of a book would not be respectful. It's a scroll written properly, etc. That's called respect for the community. And this is what we're talking about earlier. You don't just sit there and roll the Torah because of schlepping out Tircha de Tibura is a kind of an affront or disrespect to the community. Because anytime the Sefer Torah is out, many people stand. So the time you take the roll, you're gonna have them standing the entire time. On a Yom Tov, when you need to read two different parts, why? You're reading the first part about the Yom Tov, and then say Kaddish and say Maftir in the second one. If I have to roll, I'm rolling from one side of the Chumash to the other side of the Chumash, and we don't want to do that. Make people stand. Therefore, you take out two Sefer Torahs. So shul, Chabad here in College Park, we only own one Sefer Torah. So yesterday and the first Sunday, we had to roll. We rolled it before davening into the place of the Torah reading, so that rolling didn't have to happen. But we go to Maftir, we went from Bereshit, from the fourth parsha of the Torah, all the way till Parshas Bamidbar, 2-3 chamashim later, right? The fourth of the 5. So I stood up, and this is what I always do at that point. And I say, I'm going to say a couple of words where they're rolling, so it's not just waste of time for the community. Especially yesterday, we didn't give any sermons due to the moving through the davening. And I always start off and say, if somebody doesn't want this extra time or this extra speech, please donate a second Torah scroll. We won't have it. 25 years later, no one's taking me up on my offer. I guess they like what I have to say. But in any event, so this is why shuls take out 2 or 3 Sefer Torahs as needed. But one person should not be reading one thing, even if it's one theme, in 2 Torahs. The same thing we said earlier about the Kohen. Someone's going to say, you know why he had to read in the second one? Because the first one was found to be puzzled. There's a mistake in it. So therefore it was no good. He started to read it in the second one. Which, by the way, if there is a mistake found, it's another complex question. When the mistake forces you to take out another one, when it doesn't force you to take out another one, what if you do a middle of Aliyah, after Aliyah? These are some of the complicated halachos that happen on the spur of the moment, that the rabbi, whoever's in the community, has to look at the letter, decide if it's kosher, decide if it's not kosher, and if it's not kosher, decide what to do, etc. But that's not discussed here in the Rambam. No, we just read that. Chav Dalet 24. The commentaries explain this as best I can find the following: that as you roll the Torah, you should roll it that the word should be on the inside, and the parchment should be on the outside. And then you kind of tie it internally before you put on the cover. That seems to be how the Ramah and others understand this Gemara. This is a very interesting halacha. The Rambam says you have to put in the middle the stitching. If you'll see sometimes when people go to do V'zas HaTorah, they roll it a little bit to make sure that stitching is up the middle. Why? The Rambam says, it shouldn't tear. What do you mean it shouldn't tear? That if I'm lifting up the Torah, something goes wrong, one part falls, God forbid, etc., it might tear through the parchment. But if you have stitching, that might tear. And if the stitching tears, it's much easier to repair, and you're not ripping through letters and words, etc. And when you're taking a Torah out and taking it to another place to put it away, let's say you had a minyan outside and you're carrying it away back to the shul, the community is not allowed to leave until the Sefer Torah leaves. Out of respect, the Sefer Torah has to be the first to go. And if they can, they should escort it and follow behind it. So the Sefer Torah shouldn't kind of go alone, but should be escorted as it goes on its way back to its place in the Aron Kodesh. And with that, we've concluded Perek Yud Beis of the Rambam.